Brenda had always been a survivor. Life had thrown so many hardships her way, and yet she kept going. But lately, the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. It wasn't just the exhaustion from working hard to make ends meet, but the emotional toll of being constantly misunderstood and mistreated. She had faced endless struggles, but they were never as suffocating as her current situation. Her Aunt Jessie had taken her in when her mother, Angela, passed away. Angela had been the one person who truly cared for Brenda, and losing her had left a hole in Brenda's heart that nothing could fill. But Aunt Jessie, her mother's sister, wasn't the warm and loving caregiver Brenda had hoped for. Instead, Jessie was cold, critical, and indifferent. She had her own problems, primarily her battle with alcohol, which she couldn't seem to escape. Brenda was only 14 when her mother died, and she felt as though the world had crumbled around her. Jessie's home should have been a sanctuary, a place to heal, but it felt more like a prison. Jessie was often angry, blaming Brenda for things beyond her control, like her own inability to keep a steady job or maintain a healthy lifestyle. Brenda, caught in the crossfire of her aunts, frustrations had become the target of Jessie's constant verbal lashings. Jessie often accused Brenda of being lazy or useless, even though Brenda did everything in her power to help. Every day was a battle for Brenda. Jessie rarely did anything to help around the house, yet she expected Brenda to keep everything running smoothly. From cooking to cleaning to making sure everything was in order, Brenda was expected to do it all. And yet, Jessie often lashed out, calling her a burden and accusing her of being lazy. Brenda was used to the criticism by now, but it didn't make it any easier. She felt invisible in her own home. Despite all her efforts to please her aunt, there was no warmth, no kindness. Instead, Brenda was met with coldness and disdain. It was a constant cycle. Jessie would fall into her old habits of drinking, and Brenda would try to pick up the pieces. She had learned to live in survival mode, just scraping by each day. Her life had been reduced to an endless series of chores and pleading for her aunt to change. But no matter how much Brenda gave, Jessie seemed to want more, taking and taking without ever offering anything in return. It was as though Brenda's presence was nothing more than a means to an end, an obligation to be fulfilled. One of the hardest parts for Brenda was the helplessness she felt. She had grown up watching her mother struggle, but her mother's love was constant, and Brenda always knew that she was cared for. Now, she was in a home where love seemed to have disappeared. Jessie never asked how she was feeling or if she needed anything. The only time she paid attention to Brenda was when she needed something from her, like when she asked her to go to the store to buy alcohol. It was clear to Brenda that Jessie didn't see her as family. She was just a source of labor, a tool, to fulfill her aunt's desires. Yet Brenda couldn't help but feel torn. She had no other family, no other place to go. The world outside seemed so vast and unknown, and she felt so small and alone. She had always dreamed of a better life, a life where she wasn't constantly fighting to prove her worth. But with every passing day, it seemed like that dream was slipping further away. Brenda found herself increasingly frustrated. She had endured years of being treated like an outsider in her own home. She had put up with the insults, the coldness, the manipulation, but something inside her was beginning to change. It was a quiet rebellion, a growing realization that she was worth more than the life Jessie had dictated for her. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of someone who clearly didn't care. The boiling point came one afternoon when Jessie asked her once again to fetch alcohol from the store. Jessie had already refused Brenda the last time she had asked, and now she expected her to go again. Brenda's frustration exploded. How many times had she been the one to clean up after Jessie's messes? How many times had she swallowed her anger, biting her tongue, pretending it didn't hurt? But this time was different. This time she couldn't hold it in anymore. "I won't do it anymore," Brenda snapped. "You can't keep using me like this." Jessie's response was harsh and cruel, as usual. She berated Brenda, calling her selfish and ungrateful. But for Brenda, that was the moment she realized something vital. She deserved better. She had been holding on for so long, but she couldn't keep living in this toxic environment. The emotional weight of it all had finally broken her. Brenda stormed out of the house, leaving Jessie behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The world outside was uncertain and scary, but it felt like freedom. It wasn't going to be easy, but Brenda had reached her breaking point. The weight of responsibility, the weight of taking care of someone who never cared for her, was finally too much to bear. As she walked away, Brenda vowed that she wouldn't let Jessie define her life any longer. The road ahead was unclear, but it was hers to walk. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to take that first step, no matter how difficult it might be. Brenda was done being invisible. It was time for her to start living for herself. Brenda's footsteps echoed on the sidewalk as she walked away from her aunt's house, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. It was as though she had stepped into a new world, one that was both terrifying and liberating. The familiar streets seemed different now, the path ahead uncertain. She had always lived under the shadow of her Aunt Jessie's control, but now, for the first time, she was free to make her own choices, to create her own future. Yet, despite the relief that came with her departure, there was a sense of loneliness that crept into her heart. The anger and frustration she had felt towards Jessie began to shift into a deeper sadness. She had never wanted to leave her family, even if that family was flawed. Jessie had been the only one left after her mother's death, and although their relationship had been strained, Brenda had always held out hope that things could get better. She had tried so hard to please her aunt, to prove that she was worthy of love and respect, but nothing she did seemed to make a difference. Now, standing on her own, she had to come to terms with the fact that her family wasn't what she had hoped it would be. It wasn't going to change, no matter how much she wished for it. As Brenda walked, her mind wandered back to her childhood. She remembered the days before her mother fell ill, when life had been simpler, and they had shared quiet moments of joy. Her father, a soldier who had been stationed in Afghanistan, had been her hero. She held on to the memories of his love. Even though they were all too brief, his sudden death had shattered her world. The day the news came, her mother's collapse into tears, the quiet funeral, the hollow feeling that seemed to grow inside her, was a moment that would stay with Brenda forever. Her father had died a hero, saving lives on the battlefield, but the heroism was lost on her as a child. All she felt was the crushing weight of his absence. Her mother, Angela, had done her best to raise Brenda alone. But as time went on, Angela's health began to deteriorate. Chronic illnesses kept her bedridden for weeks at a time, and Brenda had to grow up faster than any child should. There were days when Angela couldn't even get out of bed, and Brenda had to manage everything on her own. She cooked, cleaned, and tried to help her mother, all while balancing her own schoolwork. But the stress of it all wore her down. They struggled financially, often going without basic necessities. Sometimes their meals consisted of bread and sunflower oil or plain noodles. Simple things, but not enough to fill the hunger they both felt. At school, Brenda was an outcast. The kids at school were brutally honest, often pointing out her worn clothes or the patches on her skirts. She learned to ignore the whispers behind her back, the stares of her classmates. But it didn't stop the pain from cutting deep. She wanted to be normal, to fit in, to have friends. But her life, so different from theirs, kept her at arm's length. She longed for a sense of belonging, but it seemed like that was always just out of reach. When Brenda was 14, her mother passed away, and her world crumbled further. She was sent to live with her Aunt Jessie, but instead of finding comfort, she found herself in a new battle. Jessie's harsh treatment only deepened the isolation Brenda felt. She didn't know how to handle it, how to navigate this new reality where her aunt, the last of her family, showed no warmth or affection. Jessie's drinking habits made things worse, and Brenda was often sent to the store to fetch alcohol for her aunt, even though there were times she could barely afford it. It felt like Brenda was caught in a cycle of being needed for all the wrong reasons. Jessie never asked how she was doing, never cared about Brenda's own struggles. Brenda had hoped for love from Jessie, but instead, she received resentment. No matter how much she helped, no matter how hard she worked to keep things running, Jessie always found something to criticize. The verbal abuse, the constant demands, wore Brenda down. But it wasn't just the criticism that hurt. It was the emptiness, the feeling of being invisible in a place that was supposed to be her home. It was hard not to wonder if she was somehow to blame for everything. Was it her fault that her aunt had fallen so deep into her addictions? Was it her fault that her mother had died? Brenda's thoughts swirled with these questions, but there were no answers, only more pain and confusion. As Brenda walked away from her aunt's house, the weight of her past seemed to follow her. The loneliness was suffocating, yet she kept moving forward. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. But she had made a choice. She had to stand up for herself. Even though the world seemed uncertain, she couldn't go back. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but one thing was clear. She couldn't stay in the cycle of misery she had lived in for so long. With every step, Brenda felt a mix of fear and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her own life. The path ahead wasn't easy, and the road was long, but she had taken the first step. She wasn't going to let her aunt's cruelty define her any longer. She was going to find a way to make it on her own, to build a life that was hers, one where she didn't have to sacrifice her dignity just to survive. As Brenda looked up, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the world around her. The journey ahead would be hard, but she was ready. She was stronger than she had ever realized, and now she was free to live her life on her own terms. Brenda walked away from her aunt's house with a mixture of dread and determination. The air outside felt different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of her decision with it. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew that she could no longer stay under the same roof as Jesse. The streets she walked down were the same ones she had walked all her life, but now they felt unfamiliar. The world felt vast, and Brenda felt small. Yet there was an ember of hope that flickered in her chest. She was free. Free to make choices. For herself. Free from the constant criticism, the toxic environment, and the weight of her aunt's expectations. She had no plan, no safety net, but the freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was as if the life she had known was crumbling behind her, leaving her to face a future that was uncertain and daunting. She had left with only what she could carry: a few clothes, her father's medal, a small box of saved-up money, her most cherished belongings, the last remnants of her past life. That was all she had, but it was enough to get started. Brenda's thoughts kept drifting back to her childhood and her mother Angela. Angela had always been a strong, loving woman. Brenda remembered her mother's laugh, the way she would comfort her when she was scared or sad, the way she held Brenda close and promised that everything would be okay. But as time went on, Angela's health began to deteriorate, and the woman, who had once been a pillar of strength, became weak and bedridden. Brenda was just a child, but she had to grow up quickly. She learned to cook and clean, to take care of her mother, and to take on the responsibilities of a much older person. Despite the hardships, Angela always made sure that Brenda knew she was loved. But when her mother passed away, it left a hole in Brenda's heart that nothing could fill. Her father's death in Afghanistan had added another layer of grief to her already complicated life. Brenda remembered the day the news came. She had been too young to understand the magnitude of it, but she understood the emptiness that followed. Her father had died a hero, but Brenda had never really gotten to know him. She had always looked up to him, but now he was gone. There was no one left to guide her, no one left to tell her it would be okay. When her mother passed away, she was sent to live with Aunt Jessie, but it had never been the safe haven Brenda had hoped for. Instead of the warmth of family, Brenda had received harsh criticism and isolation. Jessie was consumed by her own struggles, particularly with alcohol, and it felt like Brenda's presence in the house was little more than an inconvenience to her. For years, Brenda tried to please Jessie, to be the daughter she needed, but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Jessie's bitterness and addiction had pulled them further apart, and Brenda had become a shadow in her own home, doing everything for someone who never cared enough to notice. When Brenda walked away, she left that chapter of her life behind. She knew that staying with Jessie, enduring the constant emotional abuse, would only keep her stuck. But she also knew that leaving wasn't easy. It was terrifying to leave the only family she had left, to go into the unknown without a clear plan. She wasn't sure where she would go or how she would survive, but she knew that staying wasn't an option anymore. The first thing Brenda did was find a small, affordable room to rent. It wasn't much, just a tiny space in a modest building, but it was hers. She could close the door behind her and not have to worry about anyone else's expectations or demands. It was the first time in years that Brenda felt like she could breathe. She had a roof over her head, food to eat, and most importantly, she had the freedom to live her life on her terms. Brenda didn't waste any time. She knew she had to find a job. She couldn't survive on savings alone. She spent hours combing through job listings and free newspapers and online ads. But most of the jobs required qualifications she didn't have. She hadn't finished school, and she didn't have any formal education. But as she scrolled through the listings, one ad caught her eye. Janitor wanted. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and that was all that mattered. Brenda took a deep breath and dialed the number. To her surprise, the HR manager hired her on the spot. The company needed someone immediately, and Brenda was ready to work. She showed up the next day and found herself in a large office, armed with a mop and bucket. The office had been neglected for days, and the place was dusty and cluttered. But Brenda didn't mind. She got to work, determined to prove that she could handle anything that came her way. At first, it was tough. The other employees didn't give her much of a chance. Brenda was just the janitor, the one who cleaned up after everyone else. Rebecca, one of the office's more outspoken employees, was particularly cruel to her. She mocked Brenda's old clothes and told her that she didn't belong. But Brenda had learned long ago to ignore people like Rebecca. She focused on her work, keeping her head down and pushing through the insults. Despite the harsh treatment, Brenda kept her focus on the future. She didn't let herself get caught up in the toxic environment. Instead, she reminded herself that this was just the beginning. She wasn't going to be a janitor forever. She was going to build a life for herself, step by step. It wouldn't be easy, but Brenda knew that she was strong enough to handle it. With each passing day, Brenda's confidence grew. She began to believe that she could achieve more, that she could do more. It wasn't about the job she had. It was about the person she was becoming. Slowly but surely, Brenda started to build a life that was hers. The road was long and filled with obstacles, but Brenda was no longer afraid to face them. She had found her strength, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. Enda had left behind the life of constant abuse and emotional turmoil that she had endured in her aunt's house, but her new beginning was far from easy. The transition was filled with uncertainty, and even though she had taken that crucial first step towards independence, the weight of her past still lingered. Every corner of her small rented room seemed to remind her of the life she had left behind, the poverty, the loneliness, and the constant struggle to survive. Yet, despite the challenges, Brenda had made a decision to move forward, to build a life for herself, no matter how humble or difficult it seemed. The janitor job she had taken at the office was far from glamorous. It was a role that many people might look down upon, but to Brenda, it was a lifeline. She knew that she couldn't be picky. She needed to earn a living, and this was a chance to take control of her own destiny. So, she showed up every day with determination, mop in hand, and cleaned the office spaces with the same attention to detail she had once reserved for caring for her sick mother. The office was large, and there were many areas that had been neglected for days. The floors were covered in dust, the windows smudged, and the bathrooms needed thorough scrubbing. Brenda threw herself into her work, silently pushing aside the sting of being judged by others. She had been called many things in her life, worthless, lazy, even a burden. But she refused to let their words define her anymore. However, the harsh reality of the office environment soon became apparent. Her co-workers, particularly Rebecca, were nothing short of cruel. Rebecca was beautiful and confident, qualities that made her the queen of the office in her own mind. She had a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye for weakness. Brenda, with her worn-out clothes and humble job, was an easy target for Rebecca's cruelty. From the very first day, Rebecca made it clear that she saw Brenda as someone beneath her. She would make snide remarks about Brenda's appearance, mocking her old clothes and the fact that she was cleaning up after everyone. "What's that smell?" Rebecca would sneer when Brenda walked by with her mop. "Your cleaning supplies stink. Get rid of it," she would order. But Brenda had been through worse in her life. Her aunt's insults had been far more cutting, and her classmates' taunts in school had been more hurtful. She had developed a thick skin over the years, and although Rebecca's words stung, they did not break her. Despite the harsh treatment, Brenda kept her head down and focused on her job. She didn't want to make waves. She just wanted to get through the day and go home to her little room. Every evening, after her long shifts, Brenda would return to her apartment, exhausted but determined. She had never had much, but she learned to appreciate the little things: a warm meal, a clean bed, and a quiet place to call her own. These small comforts gave her the strength to keep going. But it wasn't just the physical work that wore Brenda down. It was the emotional toll of being invisible in the office. No one took the time to notice her, to appreciate the hard work she was doing. Brenda was just a janitor, nothing more than an afterthought to most of the employees. But she wasn't discouraged. Deep down, she knew she had a purpose. She knew that the role she was in was temporary, that it was just the first step on the road to something greater. She had come a long way from the girl who was once invisible to her own family. She had learned that she was capable of more, and that belief fueled her determination. One day, as she was cleaning one of the larger offices, Brenda overheard a conversation between two men who worked there. They were discussing her. One of them said that she was kind of cute, but needed to dress better. Brenda's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in a long while, someone had noticed her. But it wasn't the type of attention she wanted. It wasn't based on who she was as a person. It was based on her appearance, her clothes, and her role in the office. She felt a surge of frustration. Why couldn't people see past her job and her clothes? Why couldn't they understand that she was more than just a janitor? But as quickly as the frustration came, Brenda pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her. She had learned to be strong, and strength meant staying focused on her goals. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional toll of working in such a toxic environment began to weigh on Brenda. Rebecca's snide comments continued, and the office workers remained indifferent to her presence. Yet, Brenda kept going. She showed up every day, cleaning the same floors, scrubbing the same toilets, and mopping the same hallways. It wasn't easy. And there were days when Brenda felt like giving up. But she didn't. She had learned that life wasn't about waiting for things to get better. It was about fighting for what you wanted, even when it seemed impossible. There was a silver lining, however. Amidst the negativity of the office, one person seemed to see Brenda for who she truly was. Tim, a quiet and kind-hearted colleague. Tim began to notice Brenda's work ethic and her quiet strength. He affectionately called her Cinderella, because, like the fairy tale character, she seemed to do all the work without asking for anything in return. Tim wasn't like the others. He treated Brenda with respect and kindness, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, Tim invited Brenda out to dinner. Brenda was taken aback by the offer. It was the first time someone had invited her out for something other than work. They spent the evening talking, and for the first time in a long time, Brenda felt like she mattered. She felt like she was more than just a janitor, more than just someone to be overlooked. It was a small but significant moment in Brenda's journey, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be moments of light. Brenda knew that her life wasn't perfect and that there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't invisible. Tim's kindness gave her a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she was worthy of respect and care. She may have started her new life as a janitor, but deep inside, Brenda knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. She wasn't defined by her circumstances, and no matter how hard things got, she would keep moving forward. Despite the overwhelming challenges Brenda faced at the office, there was one bright spot that shone through the harsh environment: Tim. He was a quiet, unassuming man, a fellow employee who seemed to notice things that others didn't. To the rest of the office, Brenda was just the janitor, a worker who was invisible in their eyes. But Tim saw something more. He saw the strength and resilience that she had, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite the judgment and cruelty from others. From the moment Tim had met Brenda, he was struck by her work ethic and her unshakable composure. Brenda never complained, never asked for recognition, even though she was often belittled and mocked. Tim admired her for this. While the office was filled with people who gossiped and put others down, Tim was different. He believed in seeing the best in people and treating them with respect. He started calling Brenda Cinderella, a playful nickname that, though simple, was also a quiet acknowledgement of her quiet strength. Just like the fairy tale, Brenda seemed to do everything with little to no recognition, but Tim recognized it, and that mattered to her more than anything else. Tim's kindness was a small spark in an otherwise dim and cold office environment. While everyone else around her was caught up in their own petty dramas and criticisms, Tim took the time to talk to Brenda, to ask how she was doing, to make her feel seen. His gesture of calling her Cinderella wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder that there was someone who noticed her, who understood the hard work she was putting in, even though others treated her like she was invisible. It was this small gesture of kindness that made Brenda feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had always believed. One evening, after a long and tiring shift, Tim invited Brenda out to dinner. This invitation threw Brenda off guard. No one at the office had ever invited her out, and she wasn't sure how to react. Her mind raced, wondering if Tim was just being nice out of pity. But as they sat down at a quiet cafe that evening, Brenda began to realize that this wasn't about pity, it was genuine friendship. Tim didn't see her as the janitor. He didn't see her as someone to be looked down upon or ignored. He saw her as a person worth spending time with. They talked about everything: their lives, their dreams, their struggles. For the first time in a long time, Brenda felt heard, valued, and respected. She wasn't just the person who cleaned the office. She was a woman with thoughts, feelings, and experiences worth sharing. Tim's kindness was refreshing. It reminded Brenda that there was still good in the world, that not everyone saw her through the lens of her job or her clothes. For a brief moment, she was able to forget about the harshness of the office, the constant judgment from her coworkers, and the years of emotional neglect from her aunt. Instead, She felt like she was just a normal woman, having a normal dinner with a kind man who valued her as an equal. But just as quickly as this warmth entered her life, Brenda realized that things weren't as simple as they seemed. The next day, things began to shift. Tim, who had once seemed so genuine, began pulling away. He avoided eye contact, changed the subject whenever they spoke, and seemed distant. Brenda couldn't understand why. What had happened to the man who had shown her kindness the night before? Her suspicions were confirmed when one of Rebecca's friends, Nancy, confronted her in a harsh whisper. "Are you out of your mind, spending time with Tim?" Nancy sneered. "He's Rebecca's boyfriend. Don't you know they're engaged? Do you really want to make trouble for yourself? Just wait until she becomes department manager, and then you'll see what happens." The weight of Nancy's words hit Brenda like a punch to the gut. Tim hadn't told her about his relationship with Rebecca, and now Brenda felt betrayed. She had allowed herself to believe that Tim's kindness was real, that he genuinely saw her for who she was. But now it seemed that Tim had only been kind to her because it was convenient. His avoidance of her the following day made sense now. He was trying to distance himself from her, trying to keep the peace with Rebecca, who was not only his girlfriend, but also an ambitious, calculating woman who would stop at nothing to maintain her status in the office. The realization stung. Brenda had trusted Tim, had allowed herself to believe that someone in this office might see her for who she truly was, but now it felt like she had been played. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to let this setback define her. She had fought too hard to get to where she was, and she couldn't let someone else's actions knock her down. From that moment on, Brenda's perspective shifted. She no longer waited for Tim to come around or for anyone to notice her. She learned that her worth wasn't dependent on how others saw her. It was about how she saw herself. She wasn't just a janitor, just a woman with worn-out clothes. She was strong, capable, and worthy of respect, whether Tim or anyone else acknowledged it or not. Though Tim had become distant, Brenda refused to let his actions determine her self-worth. She had come so far in her journey, and no one, not even someone she had once trusted, could take that away from her. As she continued her work at the office, Brenda kept her focus on what was important: her independence, her growth, and her future. Tim's kindness had been a fleeting moment of warmth, but it was a moment that reminded Brenda of her own strength. And in the end, that was all she needed. Brenda had spent the last few months in the office working quietly, enduring the mistreatment from Rebecca and the cold indifference of her co-workers. Each day she arrived, did her job, and kept her head down, trying to avoid the harsh comments and stares. The loneliness and alienation she felt in that office were palpable. She had expected the job to be difficult, but the constant negativity, from Rebecca in particular, made it unbearable. Rebecca, who had been the office's self-proclaimed queen, was always at the center of attention. She thrived on control and belittling others, and Brenda had become her favorite target. Her cruel words, taunts, and subtle jabs at Brenda's worn-out clothes and humble job felt like personal attacks. Brenda had learned to keep quiet in the face of Rebecca's insults, but it was starting to eat away at her. As days passed, Brenda became more and more frustrated. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the harshness of the world, retreating into the shadows, trying not to draw attention to herself. But now, after everything she had been through, losing her parents, being cast aside by her aunt, struggling to make ends meet, Brenda had come to a realization. She couldn't live her life in silence any longer. She couldn't let people like Rebecca walk all over her and make her feel worthless. She wasn't that girl anymore, the one who let others define her. She was strong, and she deserved to be treated with respect. One day, as Brenda was working in one of the larger offices, she overheard Rebecca and a few other co-workers gossiping. About her? Rebecca's voice was as sharp as ever, mocking Brenda's appearance, her clothes, and the fact that she was a janitor. "Look at her," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's cleaning the place as if she owns it. I mean, really, those clothes are so out of date, and that mop—" She trailed off with a laugh, and the others joined in, their laughter echoing in Brenda's ears. For the first time, something inside Brenda snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. All the hurt, the years of being treated as less than, the cruel remarks from Rebecca, it all came crashing down in that moment. Brenda stood up, her heart pounding, and walked straight into the middle of the office, where Rebecca and her group of followers were talking. It was bold and it was risky, but Brenda had had enough of being silent. Rebecca barely acknowledged her at first, too engrossed in her own conversation. But when Brenda spoke, it was clear that this time, it was different. "You don't know me, Rebecca. You don't know anything about me," Brenda said firmly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You can mock me, belittle me, and criticize me, but I'm not going to let you treat me like I'm invisible anymore. I'm here, I'm working hard, and I deserve the same respect that everyone else gets. So, stop acting like I don't belong." Here. For a moment, the office fell silent. Rebecca, taken aback by Brenda's sudden outburst, stood there with a stunned expression on her face. The other employees, who had been too afraid to speak up or who had followed Rebecca's lead, watched in silence. Brenda could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't falter. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to argue or dismiss her. Rebecca, never one to back down, opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the sound of someone clearing their throat interrupted. It was Tim, the man who had been Brenda's only friend in the office. He stood in the doorway, watching the exchange. Tim had always been kind to Brenda, but he had distanced himself when Rebecca started to target her. He had seemed afraid to take sides to stand up for her. But now, watching Brenda stand her ground, he seemed to have a change of heart. Tim walked into the room, his presence commanding attention. He looked at Rebecca, then at the other employees, and finally at Brenda. "She's right," Tim said, his voice steady. "Brenda is doing her job, and she's doing it well. You all know it, and she deserves to be treated with respect. It's time we stop treating her like she's invisible." Rebecca, realizing that she had lost her audience, scoffed and turned away. But the damage was done. The others in the office, who had silently watched Brenda endure Rebecca's cruelty, now looked at her differently. They didn't speak up, but they had witnessed something important. They had witnessed Brenda's courage. They had seen her refuse to be silent, refuse to be ignored. That day, something shifted in the office. Brenda had finally found her voice. She had stood up for herself, not just for the sake of her own dignity, but for the dignity of anyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. It was a turning point in her journey, one that gave her a newfound sense of self-worth and confidence. She wasn't the janitor anymore. She wasn't just someone to be dismissed because of her job or her appearance. She was a person who deserved respect, just like anyone else. In the days that followed, things weren't perfect. Rebecca still made snide remarks when Brenda wasn't around, and the office dynamics were still tense. But Brenda's stand had made a difference. Tim, who had once been too afraid to stand up to Rebecca, now spoke to Brenda with more respect and kindness. And though Brenda had no illusions about the office's toxic atmosphere, she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like someone who had control over her own life, someone who had the power to shape her own future. As the days passed, Brenda realized that this was just the beginning. Standing up to Rebecca was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was a reminder that no matter how hard life got, she could always find the strength to stand up for herself. She had fought too long and too hard to be silent any longer. And now, as she walked through the office, she held her head high, knowing that she had earned the respect of at least a few people around her, most importantly, herself. Brenda had fought tirelessly to survive, clawing her way out of the dark hole her life had seemed to be for so long. Her new job, her small room, and the modest life she had carved out for herself had been hard-won, but now something was shifting in her life. The oppressive weight of her past was slowly being replaced by a new sense of purpose and direction. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a way forward, building a future that didn't feel like it was dictated by the trauma and hardships she had faced. For the first time in her life, Brenda was starting to see the possibility of something more. The job at the office, though difficult, had become a foundation. Despite the toxic atmosphere and the harsh treatment from Rebecca, Brenda had found her voice, stood up for herself, and proved that she wasn't going to let anyone define her. The respect she had earned from a few colleagues, especially Tim, had given her a glimpse of what it might feel like to be seen for who she truly was, a person worthy of dignity and respect. And that shift in how she saw herself was transforming her life. However, Brenda knew that she couldn't stay stagnant. She wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't just someone cleaning up after others. Her job was a starting point, but she had bigger dreams. Dreams of independence, of growth, and of a future where she could thrive rather than merely exist. But without an education or any formal qualifications, her options seemed limited. Brenda had always been practical, and she knew that her next step had to be calculated. She couldn't afford to wait around hoping for something to fall into her lap. She needed to make things happen for herself. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting shift, Brenda sat in her small room, her mind racing. She had been saving every penny she could, working tirelessly at her janitorial job, but that wasn't enough if she wanted to build a real future. She needed something more, something that could lead to better opportunities. Brenda remembered the conversations she'd had with Tim about her dreams of going back to school. But the thought of college seemed impossible. How could she afford it? How could she find the time? And most importantly, how could she navigate a world that had never been kind to her? It was then that she made a decision. She couldn't wait for someone to hand her an opportunity. She had to create it herself. Brenda began researching online. Courses, finding affordable options in areas like customer service, administration, and marketing. She even started looking into free resources for improving her skills in computers, something she had always struggled with. She knew that she couldn't go back to school in the traditional sense, but she also knew that learning wasn't confined to a classroom. There was a world of knowledge at her fingertips, and she was determined to use it. Brenda committed herself to this new path. After work, she would sit at her small desk where a battered old computer sat and go through online lessons. Some days were harder than others. After a long day of cleaning, all she wanted to do was collapse into bed. But the thought of a better future, the dream of something more, kept her going. She pushed through the exhaustion, forcing herself to keep learning. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but Brenda was relentless. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for things to change. She had to be the change. Her determination didn't go unnoticed. At work, Tim saw the transformation in Brenda. He had always admired her strength, but now he could see the quiet ambition in her eyes. Brenda wasn't just cleaning the office anymore. She was preparing for something greater. One evening, as they sat together after work, Tim mentioned an opportunity that had come up. His company was hiring for an entry-level position in marketing, and while it was a long shot, he thought Brenda might be a good fit for it. Brenda's heart skipped a beat. A marketing position? She had never considered it. It seemed like a far cry from the janitorial work she had been doing. But as Tim explained more about the job and the skills they were looking for, Brenda realized that she was more qualified than she had initially thought. She had been working on her communication skills, had a basic understanding of digital tools, and her dedication to learning had given her the confidence to try something new. It wasn't the perfect opportunity, but it was a stepping stone, and Brenda knew that she couldn't pass it up. With Tim's encouragement, Brenda applied for the job. She spent hours revising her resume, using the skills she had learned from her online courses. It was nerve-wracking, but she submitted her application, hoping against hope that she would get a chance. And, to her surprise, she did. The interview was a blur, but when the offer came, Brenda couldn't believe it. She had gotten the job. This new chapter of Brenda's life wasn't without its challenges. The marketing position was demanding, and she had a lot to learn. But it was a far cry from scrubbing floors and being invisible. For the first time in years, Brenda felt like she was moving toward something meaningful. The job didn't come with the instant respect she had hoped for, but it came with a sense of accomplishment and the knowledge that she had earned it through her own efforts. She was no longer defined by the past or by the labels others had placed on her. She was creating her own future. As Brenda settled into her new role, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The girl who had once been invisible, overlooked and neglected, was now a woman with a purpose, a woman who had carved out a life for herself despite the odds. She was building a future based on her own decisions, and she was proud of it. Every step she took, no matter how small, was a step closer to the life she had always dreamed of. Brenda's journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally on the right path. With every success, no matter how small, she grew more confident. She had learned to trust herself, to believe that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. And now, with her new job, her new sense of purpose, and the support of Tim, Brenda felt like she was stepping into a future that was hers to create. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. Brenda's life had been filled with hardships, betrayal, and constant struggle. For years, she had fought to survive, relying on her strength to endure the emotional and physical challenges life had thrown at her. She had endured the coldness of her Aunt Jessie, the loss of her parents, and the harsh judgments of others. But despite it all, Brenda had found the courage to change her life. She had fought her way out of poverty, secured a job, and begun building a future. Yet, even in her most hopeful moments, she had never imagined that she would find someone who truly saw her, someone who would love and accept her for who she was. But then came Eric. Eric, the son of Mr. Jefferson, the kind man who had helped Brenda when she had nowhere to turn, had become an unexpected part of Brenda's life. Initially, she had seen him as a figure of authority, a man who represented the company where she had started her new job. But over time, Eric's presence in Brenda's life had transformed into something deeper, something she had not anticipated. His kindness, his understanding, and his respect for her had shifted the trajectory of her life in ways Brenda hadn't realized until she found herself falling for him. It wasn't love at first sight, but the connection between Brenda and Eric was undeniable. They had become friends first, two people who had shared similar struggles and could understand each other in ways that no one else could. Eric had listened to her, not as a subordinate or a colleague, but as a person. He had seen her for the woman she was, not for the janitor she had been, not for the girl who had been treated like an afterthought by everyone else in her life. Slowly, over time, Brenda found herself confiding in him. She shared her pain, her history, and her dreams. And Eric listened with patience, without judgment. Brenda had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, and now Eric was the first person who truly made her feel seen. He didn't pity her. He didn't look at her with disdain or condescension. He simply respected her for who she was and what she had overcome. This was something new for Brenda, something she hadn't known she needed. And in turn, she began to open up to him more, allowing herself to feel vulnerable in a way that had once seemed impossible. It was during one of their late-night conversations that Eric had finally expressed his feelings for her. "Brenda," he said one evening, his voice soft, "I've been watching you for a while now. You're stronger than anyone I know. You've fought through so much, and you've come so far. I admire you, and I think you're incredible." Brenda's heart had skipped a beat at his words, but she couldn't bring herself to respond immediately. She had never known love like this before. She had never been treated with such care, such tenderness. It was hard for her to believe that someone like Eric could truly care for someone like her, but Eric's sincerity shone through. Over time, as they spent more time together, Brenda began to realize that his feelings were genuine. He wasn't interested in her because of her past, her job, or her struggles. He cared about her because of who she was in the present, the person she was becoming. And as her heart began to open to him, she found herself wanting to give him the same love, the same trust that he had shown her. Their relationship blossomed slowly but steadily. They started spending more time together outside of work, going on walks, grabbing coffee, and even cooking meals together. Brenda found herself looking forward to the small moments they shared, moments where she didn't have to worry about anything but the joy of being in his company. Eric made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in years. He made her feel cherished, loved, and important. As their relationship deepened, Brenda also began to see more of the complexities of Eric's life. He wasn't the perfect, flawless man she had initially thought. He had his own struggles, his own scars from the past. But instead of shying away from them, Eric was open and vulnerable with Brenda. He shared his fears, his insecurities, and his dreams with her, allowing her to see him for who he truly was, beyond the polished exterior. Brenda admired him even more for his honesty, for his willingness to let her in. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Brenda had her doubts about whether she was good enough for Eric, doubts about whether she could fully let go of her past and embrace a future with him. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain of rejection, that it was hard to trust anyone, especially someone as kind and genuine as Eric. But with time, she learned to open up, to trust him, and to trust herself. One day, Eric did something that took Brenda by surprise. He invited her to a family dinner. It was a big step, one that Brenda hadn't anticipated. Eric's family was well established and successful, and Brenda was afraid that she wouldn't fit in. But Eric reassured her, telling her that he wanted her to be a part of his life, and that meant including her in the things that mattered to him. The dinner was warm and welcoming, and Brenda quickly found herself enjoying the company of Eric's mother, Monica, who was kind and genuine, and his father, Mr. Jefferson, who had always treated her with respect and admiration. As the evening wore on, Brenda began to feel more at ease. She could see how much Eric loved his family and how much they loved him in return. It was clear that he had been raised with love, care, and respect, and that he was now sharing that love with her. It was a beautiful realization for Brenda. She had never experienced a family dynamic like this before, and it filled her with a sense of warmth and belonging. That night, as Brenda and Eric returned to her apartment, Eric took her hand in his and smiled softly at her. "I'm so glad you're in my life, Brenda," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Brenda smiled, her heart full of gratitude. She had come so far, and now she had found love with someone who truly cared for her. As she looked into Eric's eyes, she knew that this was just the beginning. They had a future to build together, a future filled with love, growth, and the promise of new beginnings. And for the first time in her life, Brenda believed in the possibility of happiness, of peace, and of a life worth living. With Eric by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held.